Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about the best artillery races in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Now, when I'm doing these kind of lists, I'm not just considering about, oh, how good is their melee roster or range roster, it's also how good is the race itself, because if your roster in a particular department is good but is very weak otherwise, then you're not really a race that deserves to be on the spot, unless, in this case artillery, really complements the playstyle of your race, and if you were to take that artillery away, the race would be significantly weaker. This will certainly apply to one of the races on this list. But first we have to start with an honorable mention, the Skaven. Now, I'm not quite sure what to do with the Skaven on a list like this, because on one hand, you could consider them to have some of the very best, if not the best, artillery in the entire game, with some really great choices, as well as heroes that really buff it up, because having heroes that give you reload time reduction, ammunition, as well as missile strength is really significant. But the question is, do you consider the Skaven to have great artillery, or do you consider them to have great range units? Or both, really. Because here's the thing about the Skaven artillery line. When it comes to pure artillery, you have the Plague Claw catapults and you have the Warp Lightning cannons. Now, Plague Claws are pretty good, but they can dodge their shells. They're also a tier 3 artillery unit. They're substantially better than mortars. They're capable of knocking down walls and wall towers, so they're pretty good when it comes to that. But there are races that have counters to Plague Claws, though Plague Claws can do an absurd level of damage and they do hurt the leadership of enemy units. Of course, Warp Lightning cannons, they're kind of in a weird spot, because you don't need these guys for the sake of knocking down wall towers or walls, and they're not necessarily going to do so well in an actual battle. Plague Claws generally will do better. So Warp Lightning cannons are kind of redundant. And those are the two real artillery options for the Skaven. Of course, this is where we get into a discussion about counting the weapon teams as artillery choices, like the Poison Wind Globadiers, the Poison Wind Mortars, as well as the Death Globe Bombardiers. Because if you're counting these as artillery choices, then yes, the Skaven have a ridiculous power of artillery. But are they artillery choices, or are they not? Because one, the Poison Wind Globadiers, they have very, very short range. They can do a good amount of damage, but pretty short range and can be vulnerable, even though they have a good amount of armor to help protect them. It's kind of funny with these weapon teams, all of them have ridiculous levels of armor, so they're actually quite resistant to ranged damage. Same with the Death Globe Bombardiers, high armor, low range, and then the Poison Wind Mortars. They have better range but lower armor, but still, all of these units do an absurd level of damage, especially if you're playing as Ikka and you go in weapon teams, you scroll down here, and you can upgrade them. So you can get some very substantial benefits with these units. It's up to people to decide how they feel about that. From a practical standpoint, I would say that I wouldn't necessarily count these as proper artillery units from quite a few perspectives. The short range that they have obviously makes them vulnerable to proper artillery units that generally have long range. And yes, if you get close enough, you can do a ridiculous amount of damage, but they're also vulnerable in terms of being able to get there. So it's a mixed bag when it comes to that. Lots of power, basically glass cannon units in a lot of ways when it comes to ranged and artillery duels. Like lots of power, ridiculous levels of damage. Like these guys, like when the Death Globe Bombardiers hit your units, you feel it. You do damage to an infantry unit, you take down half their HP, have now completely wiped them out with a single volley of these guys. So ridiculous level of power, but also some limits when it comes to that. And not necessarily something you would count as a proper artillery unit. But that's up to people to decide how they feel about that. But certainly Skaven are a race worth talking about when it comes to a list like this. Now, number 5, we have Bretonnia. Bretonnia certainly is a cavalry-focused faction, but they do actually have some really sweet artillery options. Only 2 units, but those 2 units are pretty effective. Very, very effective, and you can get them pretty early, which is actually something that does count a lot in any campaign. It's not just like how powerful a unit is how quickly can you get it during the course of a campaign. Many races, when it comes to really good units, either have them at tier 4 or tier 5. Bretonnia gets regular field trebuchets at tier 2. This is something they share with the Dwarves, so they can get artillery very quickly, and these guys can do quite a bit of damage. Though it's not really the field trebuchets that are the best either. It's the blessed field trebuchets. The blessed field trebuchets don't do friendly fire, or rather, they do friendly fire, but it's not about. But their splash damage will not hit. Will not hit your units. So the big rocks that they're firing might do, based on what people have told me, but their splash damage will not hit your own units. That is actually very significant on a lot of battles, because the ability to do damage from very high range and also do damage from close range without killing half your army in the process is a significant strength that shouldn't be underestimated when it comes to these guys. They also have magical attacks, which is always sweet to have. And here's the thing, although they're certainly a tier 5 unit, Bretonnia has a ridiculous level of growth on their settlements. Consider their minor settlements. They can get up to 60 growth in them. That is absurdly powerful, and Bretonnia certainly will have a lot of money to be able to grow very quickly. So not only do they get artillery very quickly, some basic artillery options very quickly, but they can also get the higher level artillery options much faster than many other races in the game, if not all other races in the game, just because getting a minor settlement to have 60 growth is bananas, to just say it plainly in the plainest possible way. Yes. Like, Bretonnia is limited in how many armies they can have, but they're not limited in how many structures they can have, how fast they can get their very high tier units in their campaign. Like, this is enormously beneficial, and that means they can get a lot of their units quickly, including those tier 5 artillery choices. But even field trebuchets will serve you very, very well during the course of a campaign. Like, take Rapunzel's campaign here at the start. She starts with a unit of field trebuchets. She can get another one for a confederation very quickly. All you need to do for a confederation is eliminate the Strogos Empire, then you get confederation over here with the Knights of Origo. And you get another field trebuchet. There's also a third here, but you're probably going to struggle to get Baron Tegan. Actually, there's a fourth over here, but this army is always going to be wiped out on turn 1 by Archon on pretty much any difficulty. A bit of a shame, because it would be nice to run around with 4 field trebuchets from very early in your campaign as Rapunzel. It fits their playstyle, because while Bretonnia's cavalry is obviously one of their main strengths, Bretonnia, the way you play Bretonnia, especially when it comes to sieges or battles where you might be completely outnumbered, is like you have fairly durable lords. Legendary lords, regular heroes. The paladins are nothing to scoff at. So what you do, one particular playstyle I like to engage in with Bretonnia is send my lords and heroes my paladin heroes into the middle of the enemy army. They'll survive quite a bit of damage, and then let them tar pit them. If you can succeed with this in Rapunzel, it works very well because she can debuff all them, do a bit of AoE, and then you start smashing them with artillery. It's a brilliant playstyle. It works quite well for Bretonnia, and keep in mind, you have a lot of maneuverability as Bretonnia as well on the battlefield, because obviously all your lords, all your paladins, your legendary lords are going to be mounted. So substantial amount of power when it comes to Bretonnia. They do struggle in siege battles, but having artillery available early on really helps them out with one of the main issues that they have in their campaigns, which is their issues in terms of taking settlements. They're still going to have issues because artillery can't take settlements on their own. You need to have powerful range units. Bretonnia doesn't have that. Or you need to have powerful infantry units. Bretonnia doesn't have that. But this kind of playstyle works a lot better than you might believe it is. Like, don't assume Bretonnia is just a pure cavalry faction, because if you're just relying on cavalry, you're going to struggle in sieges. You have other tools at your disposal, and having that early siege is important. Now, number 4, we have the Tomb Kings. The Tomb Kings have 2 artillery options and a third unit that you can count as artillery, and I certainly do. Unlike, say, the Skaven, where it's a bit of a discussion on that subject. So, by default, from any tier 3 settlement, they can get Screaming Skull catapults. All you need to do is get this building over here to tier 3, and you can increase your Screaming Skull catapult by 1 capacity. Capacity is certainly going to be a problem, but Screaming Skulls are certainly very effective units, certainly very effective artillery units. They have poison. Or is that just Khalida's situation? Pretty sure it might be just Khalida's situation. Yes, she does have poison attacks on all her units. A bit ridiculous having artillery of poison, I gotta say. By the way, magical attacks, decent range, not necessarily the best, but decent range, pretty decent damage. That's the default artillery option, and as a tier 3 artillery unit, I gotta say, those Screaming Skulls look really, really good, by the way. That's the baseline artillery option, but then they have a second one, which is absurdly strong. You have the Great Incantation over here that gives you a Casket of Souls. Now, you can only gain one of these every 15 turns, because that's how long it's gonna take you to be able to get another one. So these are very precious gems of artillery units, but they certainly have the power to match that. Casket of Souls, if we're gonna look at the unit roster over here, Casket of Souls are ridiculous. The sheer level of damage these things do, the number of projectiles they have, the range, the everything when it comes to these guys is insane with regards to it. And you can get these guys very early in your campaign as well, making your faction an artillery powerhouse pretty early on in your campaign. Yes, you're only going to have a limited number of these, and if you lose one, it's going to hurt a lot. But the sheer power these things have, the range they have, I dread dealing with the Tomb Kings, especially Cathay in particular, because he's riding one of these things as a mount. Imagine having an artillery piece as a mount. Yeah, that is absurdly strong, and you can get there very quickly, because all you need for this ride is just own 20 units, which is very easy to do, by the way. In any campaign of the Tomb Kings, you get this, you get the Casket of Souls, and certainly it's like, oh, my army may not necessarily be the strongest early game, but I have one of the most powerful artillery options that just wipes units off the face of the earth. It is absurd what the Tomb Kings have available over here with the Casket of Souls. It really helps out their early game situation as well. Take out the Casket of Souls, their situation early game becomes a lot harder than it already is, especially for Mr. Cetra, who can struggle. But that isn't the only option that the Tomb Kings have access to. You also then have the Bone Giants, and they're considered a specialist artillery unit by the game. It's up to you if you want to count the Bone Giants as a proper artillery unit, but considering the stats, the range, the damage, the way their projectiles are, yeah, I would certainly count them as a proper artillery unit. They're very strong, very quite durable at 80 armor. Certainly not as durable as some other units, but still pretty damn strong. And they've got a lot of range. They're not necessarily too bad at standing up in a fight. They've got a lot of HP as well. So these guys are tier 4. Obviously, unit capacity is going to be a problem, but the sheer level of power you're going to have with Bone Giants in your army, and unlike Casket of Souls, you can mass these guys. Yes, Casket of Souls are better, but these guys, when you're looking at the stats, the bonus versus large, like these guys are artillery snipers that can take down any large unit probably in some of the easiest way possible in the entire game. I'm not joking. Artillery can struggle with large units. It's a question of landing the shots, right? And while certainly some artillery units are dedicated anti-large, I've never found it too great to use them. But Bone Giants, yeah, absurd as well. You don't require tier 4 settlements to be able to get them, but really, really strong when it comes to it. And you can increase their capacity, by the way, using Necrotechs. In fact, it might be the best thing you can do in your campaign. Just get a lot of Bone Giants and unleash the true artillery barrage. Like, imagine an army of Screaming Skulls, Bone Giants, and Casket of Souls, under Khalida especially, who's going to give them poison attacks. I want to see the army capable of dealing with that in like an open field, not like forested terrain or limited terrain where your range prowess is limited, but on an open field. Absurdly strong, really powerful, and available. You don't have to pay money for it. You just need to get settlements to tier 4. And the Tomb Kings, well, certainly they don't have Bretonnia's absurd level of growth. They can still have a decent level of growth through commands from main settlement buildings and other options as well. So pretty good. When we're talking about the Tomb Kings, should never underestimate them. Underestimate the artillery prowess of the Tomb Kings at your own risk. Now, at number 3 is the Vampire Coast. Personally, I would have ranked this race even higher on this list, but the Vampire Coast certainly has a lot of issues in their campaigns, economy, their regular unit roster being pretty pathetic. But they do have some of the best artillery in the entire game. In fact, they have the best artillery units in the entire game. One of the best actual artillery unit in the entire game. So at tier 2, they get access to mortars. Now, mortars, they're not great when you're dealing with sieges for many races, but for the Vampire Coast, they actually do work very, very well. Because here's the thing. The Vampire Coast has really powerful lords and heroes, right? Be it talking about legendary lords or Morgul hunters or other heroes as well that do have a good amount of durability when it comes to, like, look at Count Noctilus. He's got 95 armor. I've played an entire campaign as Noctilus, and how I would win sieges is I would send him in through the gates. I would use my artillery to bust down any wall towers if I wasn't looking at the gap in the walls between their coverage, but I would use my artillery units. I would send Noctilus, and I would kill everything that was inside using the mortars, as well as other artillery options. Army abilities as artillery option, like artillery as an army ability, pretty damn powerful, and the Vampire Coast does have that for all their horde armies, because they're a combination of having regular settlements as well as having a number of horde armies. Limited, but still, those horde armies do have artillery support when it comes to it, because basically that represents the fleet for them. So mortars, tier 2, you can get these very, very quickly, like Noctilus over here. What you do in his campaign, you immediately start getting the officer's cabin. You don't spend any other growth points over here. You get the officer's cabin. By the time it's done, you'll be able to get the bombards, and that will give you a good, will give you the ability to recruit mortars. It does get better with carronades, because those are great against walls and great against wall towers. So mortars will struggle against that, but 2 carronades will do very well against any walls and wall towers, being able to take them down pretty quickly. And then, of course, there's a right. Unfortunately, there is only one of these, but it is absurd. Queen Bess. Queen Bess is insane in terms of the strength it has as an artillery option. You don't necessarily see it reflected per se by the damage, but it does reduce the speed of units. It does have flaming attacks, and it does have extra powder. So it does a lot more damage when its ammo is high. It's absurd to watch this shoot at enemies and just watch them getting deleted. Now, enemies can dodge its shots, but you can pin them down. You can get them to target you, especially in sieges. However, there's another reason why the Vampire Coast does do very well as an artillery race. See, they have the Gunnery Wights, and the Gunnery Wights have a really important ability. They can replenish ammunition. That is great. And it's very significant. Having an ability that gives you the ability to replenish ammunition on your artillery units is pretty damn powerful. Not everyone has this ability. Certainly, a number of the races on this video don't have this ability, and it's actually crucial to keep the Vampire Coast gun line, or the artillery line, firing. Now, I could rank the Vampire Coast higher on this video, but I think just their overall unit roster issues in general, like with their infantry, their gunpowder units, does keep them down, but their artillery is nothing to scoff at. You take away the artillery from the Vampire Coast, it ceases to be a relevant faction in any way, shape, or form. You just do that, they're basically down to lords and heroes, and that's just simply not enough in a campaign from my perspective. So artillery is really important for them. It's really good. It works very well for them. It's what keeps them going in their campaigns. You take that away, they're finished, more or less. Now, number 2, we have the Dwarves. People voted this as the number 1 artillery race. I'm going to have to take them down a peg because the Dwarves have many issues as a race right now in Warhammer 3. Maybe those issues will be fixed, but until those issues are resolved, until the Dwarves are actually a good race, they're not going to be number 1 on any list. I think that would be pretty ridiculous. However, we can't deny the artillery prowess that the Dwarves do have. So at tier 2, in any settlement, you can recruit this in a minor settlement, you can get grudge throwers and bolt throwers. Not too fond of bolt throwers, they can serve their duty, but it's really the grudge throwers that are the star of the show. Good range, good damage, quite capable of knocking down walls and wall towers and doing damage on the battlefield as well. That is pretty great as an artillery choice. You can get them very early, which is important for the Dwarves because of their really limited growth. Then at tier 3, you get cannons. You get cannons. Now, cannons are just going to be better when it comes down to taking down walls and wall towers, though I don't think their usefulness on an open field battle is necessarily as great as the stats might imply. Certainly a pretty good unit, but still really dedicated for knocking down walls and wall towers. And then at tier 4, you get flame cannons, and organ guns. Now, I'm not too fond of flame cannons. I find their range to be too limited, but certainly they have that leadership debuff. They do a lot of damage. They have flaming attacks. There's certainly benefits in flame cannons, but generally speaking, I prefer to have organ guns. Because organ guns have a bit more range, still a ridiculous amount of damage, and they shoot quite a few projectiles, like shots per volley, 4. So that is a pretty damn good amount of damage that you're looking at when it comes down to it. Short range artillery, but still pretty great. Like when the enemy closes in on your gun line, on your quarrelers, you unleash the organ guns and you annihilate the enemy that's coming towards you. Can be pretty great when it comes to that. So you have good anti-large options, good choices against massed units, good choices against walls and towers as the dwarves. And you also have the engineers as a hero, which obviously give them extra ammunition, give them triangulation, give them ammo replenishment. Very important to have that, because in a prolonged artillery fight they can run out of ammo. Even give them speed for all missile. So a great deal of power over there, and you also get ballistic calibration, which is not something to scoff at with the Deadeye chain. In fact, I'm not sure why I would ever go the Grudge Raker chain, because if you're expecting these guys to do very well in terms of their range damage, no, they're a support unit. They give you the ballistic calibration benefit over here. They give you ammunition. So a good amount of benefits here in terms of range damage, like the Vampire Coast, the Skaven, the Dwarves. Having a hero like this really helps their range line out and really helps their artillery line out, even though the Vampire Coast gun line is pretty pathetic. Not their artillery line, just their infantry gunpowder units. So yeah, the Dwarves, pretty good race, really works well with their playstyle, because the Dwarven playstyle is spamming a lot of quarrelers, maybe getting some warriors or longbeards or ironbreakers as support units to cover your flanks, killing everything in sight with the quarrelers, and of course the artillery does a lot of damage before they get in quarreler range. So it's the best playstyle for them. It complements their playstyle, and the artillery choices are pretty solid as well. The reason I don't put the Dwarves as number 1, just the overall issues with the race, the casualty replenishment, the growth, their limited recruitment slots, and all that. All those problems that I've talked about the Dwarves before. And some people will disagree with that sentiment. They believe that it should just be about the power of the units. I think that from a practical standpoint, to call the Dwarves number 1 at anything in Total War Warhammer right now would be disingenuous at best. Because you can't call a race great when they're not. They're not great. They have a lot of issues. And it would be nice to see the Dwarves really being able to unleash their power, but I guess the Chaos Dwarves are actually going to do that for them, being the better Dwarves overall. And of course, finally, at number 1, we have Grand Cathay. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with me on this particular choice. People will ask, where's the Empire? Because they have a better roster. To which my reply is, they might have some better stats on certain units, but the Empire just has way too many issues in their campaign. Their economy is good, but their unit roster is pretty awful in a lot of ways. Whereas Grand Cathay's unit roster, specifically their infantry and ranged rosters, are actually really good. Like Jade Warriors by default, heavily armored units, really cheap when it comes down to that. At tier 2 you get Jade Warrior Crossbowmen, and at tier 3 you get Halberds, which are pretty damn effective units, and Jade Warrior Crossbowmen with shield. Just bronze shields, unfortunately not silver shields, but still pretty damn effective. But when it comes to artillery, unfortunately, they can only get artillery at tier 3, but Cathay does have pretty decent growth. They don't have the best growth in the game, but they do have good growth options over here. Between their main settlement buildings, their minor settlement buildings, structures they can get, which give them a pretty decent level of growth over here. And of course, being able to achieve harmony, which is a goal in any Cathay campaign, and provincial effects as well to increase growth. Cathay does have good growth, so they'll be able to unlock those units. Of course, the Dwarves in Bretonnia getting artillery units at tier 2 is a benefit to their campaigns, but they need those artillery units. Cathay does not, actually. Yes, not being able to knock down wall towers and walls is a detriment in your campaign early on, sure, but you do start with artillery choices for both Legendary Lords. So unfortunately, they're the Sky Junks and the Fire Rain Rockets, which are not great for that, but Cathay does have the Legendary Lords able to take down settlements on their own. So they are a pretty effective faction in a lot of ways, but they're held back by the harmony system and the need to balance it out being annoying and limiting how many armies and heroes you can have on the campaign. And of course, not actually being able to build all the structures they want because of the yin yang system. So Cathay is not perfect, but they do have a lot of strength in their campaign. They have a good economy, they have the caravan system, which can give them quite a lot of money. They do have a lot of things going for them. Now, artillery choice wise, they do have the Grand Cannons at tier 3. This is great to have at tier 3, so you're gonna get the Wall Busters at tier 3, pretty effective units, pretty good range, pretty good damage when it comes down to that. And then at tier 4, they get the Fire Rain Rockets. Now, people talk about the difference between this and Hellstorm Rocket Batteries. I understand the sentiment that Hellstorm Rocket Batteries can be more effective, but the Fire Rain Rockets are not necessarily what you're using to compete with Hellstorm Rocket Batteries when it comes down to it. Besides, Cathay does have the ability of improving range units with their Alchemist heroes. Pretty sure that's counting for artillery. I could be wrong on that sentiment, but you do have the ability of improving range units across your army. Not sure if that counts for artillery or not. I think it does. Correct me if I'm wrong. But those are not the only artillery options. It's not just like, oh, they have 2 artillery units, like a Imperial Cannon that is probably better, or Hellstorm Rocket Battery that's worse just because of the ammunition issue. Ammunition certainly can hold back Cathay. They don't have a hero that can replenish their ammunition, and that can be a bit annoying to deal with when it comes down to that. Though Miao Ying does have 20% ammunition for all her armies, so she can really be good in that respect. However, there's some other options as well for artillery. Flying Hellstorm Rocket Batteries. Tier 5, sure, but as stated, Cathay does have the ability of getting good growth in their settlements. So you can get flying Hellstorm Rocket Batteries. Now, many a times I do prefer, in a campaign, I do prefer the Fire Rain Rockets, because range units will target these guys, but they do a lot of damage. They have better ammunition than the Fire Rain Rockets on a similar level actually to the Hellstorm Rocket Batteries. And of course, because they're flying from a practical standpoint, they're not going to be limited in as many situations. Having a flying artillery unit in your campaign is such a force multiplier in certain situations that it can't be ignored. The reality is, a lot of the times when you're fighting battles on a campaign map, you're not going to fight in the most ideal terrain for a ground-based army. So having the ability of doing basically the same damage with that a Hellstorm can do while flying is incredible. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, it does require a tier 5 settlement, but the ability to get these guys does exist. And there's ways of cheesing, and like you can always use the Great Bastion itself, like let an AI faction build up the Great Bastion to like tier 3, tier 4, then confederate them, then get the structure to recruit them. Cathay will not have issues. Like Cathay might be a bit slower, but the power of their campaign is there. So Skyjunks, pretty damn effective. Most of the time I do prefer an army with 2 Fire Rains and 2 Grand Cannons personally, but if I'm encountering situations where I need this in a campaign, I always have it available. Great deal of power. Great deal of power. And it's like, these guys are even better than the Gyro Bombers, because it's like they have the ability of dropping bombs on the enemy. So, good amount of power. And don't ignore the Harmony system either when it comes to these guys, right? Because they do get benefits from Harmony, reload skill in particular. When it comes down to that, so they can fire quickly. You may run out of ammunition fast, sure, but you will do a lot of damage as well very, very quickly during the course of a battle. And that is my list. Feel free to disagree, feel free to provide criticism in the comment section when it comes to that. Like, I could have included Empire on this list, but I think if anyone is being genuine at the moment, they acknowledge the fact that the Empire doesn't deserve a spot on any list where we're talking about strength. Maybe cavalry, maybe, but when it comes down to it, like, they've just got too many issues in their campaigns at the moment to deal with. Their hero choices are lackluster, their legendary lords are okay, but not great. Like, you take Miao Ying against any legendary lord of the Empire or her brother, it's like, they'll win that duel. Like, you take a Cathayan army against an Imperial army, I'm telling you one thing straight. Unless it's an army full of Electro Count units with all the items that the Empire can get in their very late game, Cathay would win that hands down. They just have better units at the end of the day. That's really all it comes down to it. And their army just makes a lot more sense for their particular playstyle. The Empire might have a lot of versatility, sure, but if the units individually are weak, then it doesn't really amount to much. Anyway, that's all for now. Questine here, signing out. Stay tuned for more.